These are living brain cells, seen by time-lapse photography. There are 10 billion such cells in the human brain. The activity of these fantastically complicated cells accounts for every human thought and action. I'm Eric Sevareid, but what am I? What are you? What gives us consciousness, awareness? Why do some things give us pleasure and other things cause pain? These questions are not original with me. Plato asked them 2,000 years ago. But Plato said that mind was one thing, matter another. Was he right? Matter occupies space. Are we sure that a thought or a feeling does not? Today, the human brain is being studied in laboratories all around the world. One of the largest laboratory settings is at the National Institutes of Health at Bethesda, Maryland. Here, the director of basic research on the brain is Dr. Robert Livingston. Bob, what does brain research now tell us about things like consciousness and emotions and appetite?
Eric, we're a long way from anything like complete answers to questions like this, but the answers will come. I'd like to tell you something that we know about two parts of the brain, the cortex on the surface and the brain stem down here. This folded sheet of tissue here is called the cortex. We know that it relates to our motor and sensory systems. Specific areas of it relate to our body movements, our speech, our sight, and our ability to hear.
But Bob, all this gray matter looks alike. How do you know those things?
One way to find out, Eric, is in the hospital operating room, such as this one at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore.
On.
Neil, 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 Neil,
Off.
Neil.
There is no response from that point. Well, now, you can see that we've obtained no
This
response
patient has had epilepsy for 7 years.
over this portion of
In this brain operation, they hope to remove a scar which causes these seizures, and he has a 50-50 chance to be entirely normal afterward with no seizures.
How dangerous is the operation?
It's not dangerous. There's no risk to his life in this.
Then here of arm,
The brain surgeon down there is Dr. Earl Walker.
patient felt the sensation of the
This
face
is not an experiment.
here.
Dr. Walker must determine the location of certain brain functions in that particular patient. He does this in order to avoid injuring vital brain areas during the operation itself.
Now, if I stimulate again, a little lower down along this same convolution,
That pencil-like instrument in his hand is an electrode. Each time he applies it to the patient's brain, a weak electric current stimulates that part of the brain. You'll see how it evokes a body movement or a sensation.
ready, on,
Neil, 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 Neil. There was no movement, sir.
nothing at all. Buddy, did you feel anything?
Yes, I did.
What?
I felt that my hand was numb.
Well, your whole hand?
Yes, sir, my hand and fingers.
Pointed finger, I see.
He's awake through all this?
He's awake through it all. He can tell the surgeon things that will be helpful to the surgeon in terms of this brain mapping.
That's why he's kept awake.
That's why he's kept awake.
Is it true that one does not feel pain in the brain itself?
No, it doesn't hurt to stimulate the brain.
Ready, on.
Neil, Neil, Neil.
Now, if I stimulate again, further forward, ready, on,
Neil, Neil. Left hand is shaking. Left wrist is twitching. Left wrist is twitching. Left wrist is twitching. Stop.
stop. Twitching of the left wrist and hand. you can see that there was a response from stimulation of that point in the left hand and wrist. Once more, ready? On.
The left wrist is beginning to flex.
Off.
The left elbow is bending. The fingers are twitching. The hand is twitching. The arm is shaking. Stop.
Buddy, what happened?
My fingers and hand moved.
Did you move them?
No, I didn't.
This I don't quite understand, Bob. Why do you have to remap, rechart each individual brain? Aren't they all alike?
One brain is not exactly like another any more than our faces are exactly alike.
All ready? On.
Nil, 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 nil.
Ready? Off.
There was
Anything
no
happen?
movement, sir.
Nothing at all. Buddy, did you feel anything?
I didn't feel anything, but I heard something.
What did you hear?
It sounded like music.
Was it any particular piece that you could recognize?
No, but it's something like I've heard before.
Was it a band or an orchestra or just an
I-
instrumental piece?
I couldn't tell, but it...
That was a part of the patient's memory, Eric. The electrical activation of that particular part of his brain brought out that memory.
Buddy, I want you to help me this time. I want you to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And to keep on counting, not stop on account of anything. You understand? Okay, buddy, let's go.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
On.
Nil, nil.
Ready? Off.
7, 8, 9,
Buddy, why did you stop counting?
12, 13.
Buddy,
I just couldn't help it.
you knew that you weren't counting?
I tried to, but for some reason I just couldn't.
Couldn't count. All right. All right, now, buddy, you ready again?
Yes.
Bob, then the cortex is like a mosaic, with each part responsible for a specific action or sensation. It's what makes us see and feel and move.
That's partly true, Eric. You may have noticed when Dr. Walker stimulates the cortex and the patient gives a response of a movement or tells what he feels, it's very detached, it's impersonal, it's unemotional. It's an automatic response, and the patient has no direct control over it. He doesn't seem to belong to it, as it were.
Well, Bob, then where are the centers that really control our movements, that create our emotions and our appetites and make us do what we do? Where do we really live?
Eric, we live downstairs in the old primitive brain that lies covered with cortex in the center of the brain. The cortex that covers the outside of the brain is a relatively new development in the scheme of evolution. Look at this plan of the brain of a frog. It's all old brain. When we come to a primitive reptile, we see it's only a smidgen of cortex. The bird has only slightly more. But when we come to the first mammals, we begin to see more and more cortex as we go on up the scale of evolution. Finally, in man, the cortex mushrooms out, covering the whole outer surface of the brain, enclosing this primitive brain. If you take the cortex of the human brain off, you can see the old brain hidden underneath. And here it is, on the other side, the brain stem and the old primitive brain making up the center, enclosed by the cortex. This old brain has persisted through the whole line of evolution, Eric.
You mean that my brain is organized on the same plan as a snake's or a frog's?
Yes. Although your brain has undergone a lot of elaboration and expansion. It's 1,000 times heavier than a frog's. It means much more to you in terms of what you can experience and are able to do.
I thank you. Tell me, Dr. Livingston, How do you know exactly what the old brain downstairs there actually does?
Well, Eric, we take advantage of the very fact that the animal's brain is built on the same plan as our own. So we can study these functions in animals, draw conclusions from them, and from that make predictions and understand more about our own brain. See these electrodes, Eric? 25 years ago, Walter Rudolf Hess in Zurich developed a technique for implanting these electrodes deep within the brain of an animal without causing damage or pain or discomfort to the animal. This was a big step. Now, for the first time, we could stimulate the deep, primitive portions of the animal's brain while the animal is freely moving and awake. Until recently, there was much controversy about what this part of the brain can do. This is called the reticular formation. It's part of the primitive brain. Ted Magoon and Jack French implanted electrodes in the reticular formation of a cat's brain. By stimulating the cat through these electrodes, they were able to activate this small region of the brain. Ed Everts here will show us what Magoon and French found. Ed has implanted electrodes in several different locations in the cat's brain. The cat's been kept awake all night so that he'll be sleepy today. You'll notice he doesn't stir even while we're talking. Ed, would you apply a small electrical current to the cat's reticular formation?
Bob, I'd wake up too if you sent an electric current through my head.
No, you wouldn't, Eric. It would depend entirely on what part of the brain was activated. Now the cat's gone back to sleep again. Ed, would you use another electrode in the cat's head to stimulate another region? You see, the cat doesn't wake up. Now, Ed, would you stimulate once more in the arousal area, please? You see, every time the reticular formation is stimulated, the cat wakes up. When another region of the brain is activated, the cat doesn't seem to notice. By mapping the interior of the brain in this area, Ted Magoon and his associates at UCLA demonstrated that this part of the brain is essential for arousal. In fact, they called it the reticular activating system because this region can activate the whole rest of the brain. It's this part of the brain that wakens us from sleep. We stay awake by keeping this mechanism active. Drugs that make us sleepy and drugs that make us stay awake act in this area. Sleep, wakefulness, alertness, attention, these functions were the business primarily of the psychologist previously. Now we know that certain brain mechanisms are linked to these, and we can work together with a psychologist to explore them. Neil Miller and his colleagues up at Yale University have been studying a particular region in here of the primitive brain.
You've just seen Dr. Everts wake up a cat. He produced a general arousal. I am interested in studying those areas of the brain which seem to have the more specific motivating effects that are necessary for survival. What parts of the brain specifically drive the animal to seek food when hungry, or drive him to flee from his enemies when in danger? Ted Koons and I wanted to find out whether the drive of hunger can specifically be aroused by electrical stimulation of certain primitive parts of the brain. As soon as we stimulate this cat's brain, it starts to drink. But wait, perhaps as in the brain operation you saw, we are only stimulating a motor response, an automatic action. How can we be sure the cat is really hungry? Well, let's move him to one side. You see, he licks the floor. It evidently wasn't hungry after all. The stimulation only caused automatic licking. This shows us that we have to be careful. Brain stimulation can produce automatic activity without arousing a true hunger. This rat has been taught, when hungry, to push through that little door to get the food. Now, when he's not hungry, we'll stimulate his brain. If our stimulation arouses a true appetite, he'll push through that obstructing door in order to get the food. The rat goes through the door to get the food. So, it's not an automatic action. But how do we know that it really is hunger? Maybe it's just a general arousal mechanism that activates whatever habits the animal happens to have been taught. How can we test this? Here's a well-fed rat drinking from a water tube. If we stimulate his brain, and if that activates only general arousal, this rat will just drink faster. Let's watch. You see, he leaves the water and he goes to the food. This certainly demonstrates that stimulation of this part of the brain does arouse a specific drive, which apparently is hunger. But what about a different kind of drive, such as fear? You can readily appreciate that this drive is important for survival. Realistic fear protects us from danger. Jose Delgado, Warren Roberts, and I wanted to see whether we could arouse a drive like fear by stimulating specific parts of the brain. We implant electrodes in a different part of the cat's brain. We make sure the cat is very hungry. We give him food. And as he eats, we stimulate his brain. Watch. He lurches away from his food. But is he really frightened? No. He goes right back to his food after each stimulation. A truly frightened cat won't do that. So all we produced in that cat was a strong automatic action. He was stimulated in the motor cortex. But what will happen if we stimulate another cat in a more primitive part of the brain, an area that elicits fear, either directly or indirectly? Watch. After just one small stimulation, you can see how reluctant he is to go back to his food. He is extremely reluctant. But what does all this mean? I think that these results, along with those of other experiments like them, show that stimulation of certain specific parts of the primitive brain acts in many ways like natural hunger or fear. This is a step toward a better understanding of the mechanism of these basic drives.
I must say, Bob, this suggests a rather negative view of human life, it seems to me, that our behavior is generated by uncomfortable appetites and painful states of feeling like fear.
I think it is, Eric, to a large extent, but that isn't the whole story. Jim Olds, here in a laboratory of the Michigan University, and colleagues of his at McGill and UCLA, have been working with a part of the primitive brain further forward than that under study by Neil Miller. This experiment we're now watching opens the question of whether all behavior is shaped by our needs, discomforts, and fear.
I wanted him to go to the corner marked A. How did I do it? By stimulating every time he took a step in that direction. And instead of trying to get away from the stimulus, he tries to get more. By doing this, I can make him go to any corner I choose. Believe me, we were surprised when we first found that we could control a rat's behavior this way. The experiment you just saw right here was the first step in showing that the brain houses not only mechanisms of punishment, it also houses mechanisms of reward. We found these rewarding areas in the upper part of the old brain. Here, 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 and here. But how could we be sure these actually were rewarding areas? How could we tell that the animal really liked the electric stimulation? In order to measure how much the animal liked it, we turn to the Skinner bar. This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet. Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on. From here on, we assured his interest. We count the rate of pedal pressing in order to see how much he likes it. There are undoubtedly many questions in your mind. You probably wonder whether the rat really likes it, or whether somehow the electricity just forces him to do again what he's just done. Will the rat solve a long and complicated maze problem, the only aim being to find the pedal and stimulate his brain? Let's see if he will. In this maze, you see a rat wandering aimlessly. Doesn't know where he's going. Eventually, he finds a lever and stimulates his brain. He can only stimulate his brain 3 times at one end. Then the mechanism turns itself off. The rat must retrace his steps in order to find the pedal at the other end and stimulate himself again. Wandering, he eventually gets there. Then he has to turn around, trace his way to the other end in order to get 3 more. One time, another time. Each time he goes faster. Gradually, he's eliminating errors. Gradually, he's learning to solve this problem for the electric stimulation alone. The route becomes more and more direct until finally he goes very rapidly back and forth. This demonstrates that he will solve a problem, the only aim being to find a pedal and stimulate his brain. Even if we take this animal out and use another animal who learned this problem a week ago, when we put him in the same maze, he'll dash around in perfect and errorless fashion to find the stimulus. All right, this is not just automatic pursuit behavior. This is also the kind of stimulation that can guide learning. I might say it's also the kind of reward that'll make an animal take an awful lot of punishment. We wanted to find just how much punishment we could make a rat take in order to find a pedal and stimulate his brain. For that purpose, we turned to the obstruction box over here. Here you see the rat happily romping across the grid. That's because there's no shock there yet. Now, I will apply the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the brain. No hungry rat in our laboratory has ever been willing to take a shock as large as this in order to get to food. They will die of starvation first. This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal. Now, what does all this show? I think we might say it shows that stimulation of this part of the brain does produce very strong positive motivation or reward. That is, it produces behavior directed toward the stimulation. It also shows perhaps that the human brain is designed not only for escape from punishment, but also for a considerable amount of enjoyment.
These are some of the ways, Eric, in which the brain is being studied to determine its organization and to determine the relationship between our brain and our behavior.
I had no idea there were ways of reaching into the brain to touch the mind, so to speak.
Well, Eric, when Mark Twain first saw a dinosaur skeleton, he was impressed too. But when he came to take a closer look at it, he found that there were only 3 real dinosaur bones, and the rest was made up out of a dozen barrels of plaster. In my opinion, the 3 real dinosaur bones represent our present limited level of understanding of brain mechanisms. In comparison with the total complexities of the whole brain, we are still immeasurably and almost totally ignorant. But there are lots of people in laboratories around the world working together to unravel these mysteries.
Thank you, Dr. Livingston. Today, more than ever before, man needs to cope with the problems involved in sheer survival. And maybe survival does depend on man's ability to understand himself. As a scientist named Paul MacLean remarked, it's too bad the secret of the brain wasn't cracked before the atom.